think um, even just before we let you guys in, we were still trying to shorten our slides because there were just so many interesting things that we wanted to share. Maybe before we jump in, Marion and Zhen, if you just maybe want to introduce yourselves. We kind of didn't think about that. So I'll start. So Sonja, I think many of you may know me. I am based in South Africa. I run a small consultancy called More Beyond, and we are working together today, Zhen, Marion, and I, as sense-making partners. So I've been involved in this work for about 2 decades now. So yeah, that's me. Zhen, do you want to go next?
Yes, thanks, Sonja. So my name is Zhen. I am currently in Singapore, where I live and work at the moment. I've been involved with working with complexity for about 11 years now, and I'm an anthropologist by training. So I'm hoping to bring that anthropological angle to the work that we do today and share a case study that we did in Singapore. So on to you, Marion.
Very good. Hi, guys. My name is Marion Kiely. I'm based in Ireland. And the angle I come at this from is from the whole psychosocial aspects of work. So the organization of work and how that impacts on employee well-being. So looking at that through a complexity lens, and yeah, delighted to be here with Sonja and Zhen today, under the umbrella of sense-making partners. So I think without further ado, Sonja, I can hand back to you. Do you want me to get the presentation up there?
Can you get the presentation going, Marion?
Okay.
So essentially what we'll be covering today is, if you can go to the next slide, Marion. Very briefly, we're going to do a bit of a framing and some context setting, and then also go through a couple of patterns that the data is showing us. So we've been doing quite a bit of work using narrative, using a tool called SenseMaker that we're going to introduce to you a bit later on, but also just in normal narrative workshops. And so some of what the stories and our interactions have shown us, so we're going to be taking you through that and some examples. Then we're going to do a bit of a demonstration to show you how we collect and use narrative at scale, and then present a couple of next step options. So that's more or less what we'll be going through today. And I think, Marion, with that, I'm going to hand over to you directly to start us off with some of the context setting.
Cool, thanks, Sonja. So you might be aware there that in the last month, Forbes had an article where they talked about turnover tsunami. So this, I suppose, is really poignant when we look at it from a HR executive point of view, from a senior leader perspective, from a COO perspective. This is not good news, as in the amount of time and money that's invested in people, and then to have people actually leaving the organization. It leaves a huge deficit. It's a real pain point, all the time that goes in then to re-interviewing, rehiring, retraining, filling the gaps, the effects on productivity. It's not good. So it's with a view to trying to anticipate that, to be aware of it, and to try and prevent that the negative side effects that come from that. That's what we're here to present on today. So I suppose obviously with all that negativity that comes from the fallout of turnover, it costs a huge amount of money, and a lot of money actually goes down the Swanee. Now there's lots of research out there on this, and I was going to present from the European Risk Observatory. I've worked out costs and what that is, but actually just yesterday I had a conversation with a client based here in Ireland, and they're working in the corporate finance sector, and they were telling me of a story that they're experiencing recently in relation to people being out because of burnout and because of stress. So I'm just going to use this example to convey some of the actual direct costs that are associated. So this employee, is currently out of work sick, and they're going to be off for 3 months is the expectation. So for a consultant to replace the person in this industry, the cost is 850 euros per day. So for 12 weeks, the cost here is 51,000 euro. That's a lot of money, But there isn't just one person out. There's currently 15 people out on sick leave in similar kind of a setup there. It's long term. It's not just out for a day or two. They're out it's expected to be around the 3 months mark, So when you look at the cost of this, it's 765,000 euro is the cost of that. And that's in 1 quarter. So if you were to look at that, for example, potentially, and this isn't me giving a scientific, this is based on a conversation, you're talking over 3 million euros worth. So this is, we're just looking at the sick leave here, and we're not looking to see if these people actually leave and we have to go and hire new people and train new people. The costs are absolutely phenomenal, you know what I mean? So it's just, as I say, with a view to actually preventing that from happening, that we're actually having this conversation today, looking at the future of work and seeing how we might actually delve in there and make sense of some of the challenges that people are facing, with a view to taking, you know, finding out at an early stage, taking action with a view to preventing that and retaining our talent, keeping up our productivity and looking after our well-being, and doing the ethical thing as well in the background. So if we look over here in relation to the turnover tsunami, last October, KPMG undertook some research, and their survey found that 4 in 10 currently employed workers are thinking about moving jobs. Just think about that for a second. Just think about your organization, however many people are there. Imagine if 4 out of 10 actually decided to leave in the morning. Where would that leave you? You know, when we talk about, you know, known knowns, like this is something that is potentially on the horizon. It's plausible, and actually it's well possible, and maybe probably even some might argue as well. When I talk to people, HR directors, some people think that this is far, far away. Oh no, we have none of that in our organization. We have no stress. Actually, if we look at our occupational health, this isn't a reality. But actually, what you will find when you dig underneath it, if you look at burnout, stress, exhaustion, mental health, there is still a huge taboo there. I know myself, I was out of work for 6 months at one stage, and I pleaded with my doctor not to put down work-related stress on that, the cert I had, the sick cert I had at the time. I was like, please take it off, because I am going to be tied up here, like in policies and stuff, and they're going to plague me to come back, because now it's a work-related incident. Do you know what I mean? I'm going to be out of work, and they're going to have to account this to the regulator. So there's a bit of fudging going on and a bit of gaming, and some employees don't want to say what it really is. So they might say they have migraines, that they have backaches, they have whatever ailments, but sometimes we don't see actually what's happening here in relation to the stress and the well-being and people not being able to cope and burnout, you know. So just because it mightn't directly be appearing, you know, on your systems, don't assume that it's not actually there at all, you know. So we're seeing here as well, there was more research undertaken last year that burnout is on the increase by 15% and engagement is dropping by 11%. So it's something that we need to take action on. It's something that's really, really important, and it deserves our attention. So I'm going to finish up with this just by saying the tools of the past, while they brought us great joy and they were very helpful back in the day, they're not going to help us going forward. We need to start looking at new ways of exploring, you know, what's actually happening in the here and the now, and to help us to take action on that. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to yourself, Sonja, if you want to take the next piece.
Thanks, Marion. Yes, and what we were thinking of doing, you know, was thank you for that, you know, just setting the scene, because I think what we wanted to just bring across is that what we're talking about today is having real business impact, or real impact on business as well as on individuals. And we want to highlight 3 key patterns. But before we go there, one of the theories that we've found really pertinent at the moment is something called Antonovsky's sense of individual coherence framework. So we've been using this a lot in face-to-face workshops, but also in our narrative inquiries. And we find that it's a really interesting framing to, you know, for both the needs of the organization, but then also what the people in those organizations are dealing with. So there are 3 primary aspects to the sense of coherence. And Antonovsky says, if you want to feel coherent as an individual, and that sense of coherence is key to organizational resilience as well, you need all 3 of these. And so he talks about comprehensibility, which is, am I able to make sense or understand what is going on, what's happening? Manageability, do I feel I have the resources, you know, so the skills, the tools, or even just, you know, social connections, so that I will be able to cope or manage with what is going on? And can I find meaning in the midst of what is happening? So meaningfulness is a really important one. And what we've seen, and what's on screen at the moment, you'll see these 2 triad images. Each dot there represents where somebody placed a story. So this is a meta pattern that we found looking across different projects in terms of where people put their stories when we asked them this question. So in your story, you know, what mattered, or what was the focus put on? Questions like those. What we saw was in the beginning of the pandemic, so towards the beginning of 2020, people were signifying their stories towards that corner of comprehensibility. So people were struggling to make sense. What we're seeing now, or well, what happened in the middle, so towards the end of last year, is people started to signify towards the bottom left corner, towards coping. So there was a very strong signal, and the stories that we were being told was around, we don't know how to cope or manage with what is going on. And in our more recent examples that we don't have on screen yet, we're starting to see a shift from coping towards meaningfulness. So it's currently a pattern that's almost shifting towards the middle of the lower end of that triad. And so that's the framing for all of this. And I want to start just by looking at the top corner, so the practicalities, making sense of this future of work, and how this is manifesting is in this entire conversation around, are we going to have a hybrid work environment? What does the future of the office look like? Do we go back to the office? You know, I think there's a really strong focus on that right now. And we actually ran a couple of projects where we gathered stories, we engaged workforces to understand, how do they make sense of this? So how do they envision the future of work, the future of the office? And so what we asked them was to describe how they are working in 2025. We used a narrative device. We had them cast into the future, describe what that looks like. And then we also asked them, like, what was the journey to get there? And if you look at the story on screen now, it's what I found really fascinating is just how creative people got in terms of describing how they think about the potential that's available in this future of the office. So this particular person went quite, creative, and he spoke about work pods. And the whole idea here was that you could have a distributed office space. And we'll, I'll give you a minute or so just to quickly scan through this. But I think what we realized is, many organizations are, going to the exco teams, or they're putting this on HR to say, you need to come up with a strategy for how we're going to handle this. When you actually engage your workforce in how do they foresee the office, how do they want to work in the future, there's a lot of creativity that gets unleashed. So this was just one example of a story. But what quickly became clear, if I go to the next slide, is that one size definitely does not fit all. What you're seeing on screen, this is a landscape that's got several hundred stories underneath it. That shows us people's attitudes and their perceptions around, returning to work. And all of these are different identities with slightly different preferences. And it runs the gamut from people saying, if you force me to go back to the office, I will resign. I never, ever want to go back to the office. There was a recent Medium article where somebody said, we don't care about the culture. We don't care about all of these arguments you're making. We want to remain at home. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got people who cannot wait to go back to the office, who says, we never, ever want to work from home ever again. So there's a whole spectrum of people. And there's almost no way to keep everybody happy. So this is a really complex problem that's facing business at the moment. And what people imagined, when we polled them in terms of what the benefits are that they can foresee with remote work and with hybrid working, is they saw greater flexibility. They can work from anywhere. You can see this person says, I can now sit on the beach in Zanzibar and still do my work. And they also foresaw less stress. So I don't have to spend any more time in traffic. I can spend more time with my children, so less stress. But unfortunately, the reality looks quite different. So people are saying we're not working from home, we are living at work. The expectations haven't changed. Marion is going to touch on that a bit later on. So the pressure is just relentless. And what we're finding is that inequalities are being highlighted, and in some instances, they're actually getting worse. So I'm going to give you a minute to have a look at these snippets. These are stories that came from actual projects. And you can see here that people are really struggling, you know, especially the story on the far right. I found that to be such a profound idea. You know, it's, I have no more sacred space. My bedroom has become a place where I'm just reminded of all the work that still needs to be done. And it's taken something that I was never willing to give away. I'm just going to spend a minute here so that you can read that. And then I have a final slide. And I found this one very profound as well, because what we're seeing is that all of these conversations about returning to the office, are we going with a hybrid model? How are we, do we give people a choice if they want to come back, or do we mandate it? You know, it feels like we are keeping ourselves busy with questions that are important, but we're not really getting to the heart of the matter. And, you know, this one I feel is important because it's highlighting inequalities. You know, now, even as we're sitting here, you are looking into my home. We are in each other's homes at the moment. And just thinking about the hours we're going to work and how we're going to work, and not thinking about the implications of that. Here in South Africa, for example, we're starting to see that men are returning to the office. Women are choosing to stay behind. Sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes they have to stay behind. But the people in the office have an advantage now because they are around when brainstorming has to happen. They're more visible. So these are some of the things that we really need to pay a lot of attention to. And then also people are feeling this extreme pressure to work very, very long hours and to perform. And I think on that, Zhen, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about the manageability and coping around this.
Thanks, Sonja. I can attest to what Sonja just described, because I believe that my team has seen all my pajamas by now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this burnout crisis that we're seeing. How, you know, a little bit about the history of it and how it's actually rearing its ugly head now, and how, you know, we actually might need to cultivate different processes and policies to actually support a greater acceptance, a greater sense of belonging. So, Marion, if we could go to the next slide. I really like this quote. Actually, I found out about this book from a brilliant New Yorker article that actually describes the history of burnout. In this article, the writer actually says that the history of burnout started from a German social worker called Freudenberger. And he was actually working in the US right around the 60s. So in the 60s, after the Vietnam War, we had a lot of veterans. They had a lot of free clinics around Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. And these free clinics tended to tend to a lot of people who had fallen out of the system. So these were people who were heroin addicts, veterans who were having PTSD. And back then, PTSD was not as recognized as a disease. So they had essentially fallen out of society. And he said that the way that the people who were suffering from withdrawal symptoms, the heroin abusers, were saying, I feel burnt out. And actually that term burnout comes from that type of history. And I just find it so interesting that that's the history. And if you look at the current evolution of its use, it's everybody has burnout. And it's a physical condition, is that you have utilized yourself, you're empty, you know, and literally inside you're physically burnt. And it's interesting because whilst in the 60s, it was an affliction that was something concerning a certain population, as this writer Han Byung-chul actually talks about it. He says every age has its signature afflictions. Burnout just happens to be ours. And he says that it's got a lot to do with the fact that we live in a world where everything is, yes, we can, we're driven by achievement. There is this addiction, to work. And if you're not working, if you're not on the treadmill, there is a sense of anxiety, right? There is a self-destructive type of cycle that goes on. Just want to show you one of the triads that came from a study that we ran. Now, Singapore had, I think, was one of the first few countries to be afflicted by COVID last year. And, in the meantime, a lot of our service workers, particularly airline workers, had lost their jobs. So Singapore created these task forces, and some of these are also volunteer organizations. What happened is they absorbed some of the people who had fallen out of these traditional service industries, and they adapted their service skills to actually help to support patients. So in this particular project, we were working with a group of volunteers who had chosen to take on a secondary role from their primary jobs to actually support the transportation of patients who had COVID. And this study was to understand, where are you? How can we support you? And I thought that the results of this triad was so shocking, because if you see, everyone is saying, in this situation, I need to become more flexible. I need to consume my personal adaptability. I need to confront the problems. Nobody's really protecting themselves. So we dug a bit deeper. Some of the stories that came out was this one. Back then, it's not that people didn't know about burnout, but it just wasn't as spoken about. Now everyone speaks about burnout. Everyone's aware that mental health is a crisis that's coming. But it's interesting for me, if you look at the story in the highlighted portion at the bottom, they're saying, back then, nobody talked about it. They should have addressed it up front, and it would have given us more respect of them. But now that, people are addressing it, the message from management is, hey, you need to practice a healthier lifestyle. You need to practice self-care. So management is saying, this is your responsibility. And then there is now, trying to navigate into the new normal. People are saying, okay, let's just go. And people are saying, no, we actually put a lot of things on hold. Business as usual is going to take a while, and we need to accept that. Some of the other stories that came out from this chapter, this one's really interesting. So Sonja spoke earlier about the inequalities that were highlighted by COVID. And in Singapore, we have this underbelly, I would call it, because we survive on a lot of migrant labor. And these are lower income migrant labor. So the conditions that they live in Singapore is less than ideal, very cramped quarters. When COVID happened, there was a beautiful article that came out in the Washington Times. They said that for all of Singapore's foresight, this was the thing that they couldn't foresee, because it's something that we've been trying to hide for so long. You can't, look into the future of something you're trying to avoid. But when COVID broke out in the dormitories, it spread like wildfire. And what happened is then they confined all these migrant workers who are living like 10 people a room to quarantine in these dorms. And it's just atrocious type of, settings. And the mental health of impact was terrible. So this person, this volunteer, was actually sharing that, we had telemedicine, but the way telemedicine is done is that you move them from physician to physician. That's not suitable long-term healthcare. So what he's recommending is we really need to improve on flexibility of policies and communication. And this is where I think the anthropological perspective is really useful. If you see, this is actually a freelancer. So he's a volunteer from a freelance background. And he's saying, I feel like I've been able to patch the process, because I realized that I'm not yet embedded in the system. So one of the recommendations that came is that we need to actually bring in more of these external views and actually get them to potentially work between the cracks. The next slide actually talks a little bit about this, this achievement type of culture. And I thought that this was so interesting, because work right now for us is no longer just work. It's not something you do. It's not something you go to. It's so entangled with our identity, our hopes, our dreams. If you look at some of these quotes, they're saying, I wasn't just there to work. I provided hope to patients. It kept me busy and sane. I was there, I ferried hope for people. I mean, if you look at this, so much of who we are is invested and embedded in our work. And just want to just bring in a little bit of theory here. I love Hannah Arendt. She's famous for the human condition. And she talked in 1958 about this concept of vita activa, right? That actually human life consists of labor, work, and action. And you need these three to come together and to have distinctions between these three, not that they're ever going to be clear distinctions, but you need for there to be distinction because they're different things and they're judged by different criteria. Labor is there to sustain human life. So this is, actually recreating things that you need for survival. Whereas work is about fabrication. So homo faber, right? Building things to sustain the world. And action is about your agency, your ability to self-actualize. And if you think about the way we're doing work now, everything is wrapped up in this concept of work. We're not making distinctions, and therefore, I think that leads to further burnout. So with that, I just want to end with this slide to say, I think that we need to really think, are we really playing a different game? Everyone's saying the paradigm is shifting, people are working differently, but are we really, have we just tried to play a different game, or have we changed the rules of engagement? And perhaps it's a time to change the rules of engagement. In other settings, right, people are able to go and seek things like mentors because most of the time we can't make sense of things. We have to fill that sense-making debt with some form of narrative that we borrow from someone else. Right now, we have no narratives to guide us. We have a collective sense-making debt. And here I'd like to pass on to Marion because she's going to talk a little bit about this search for meaning and the evolution of work that might help us.
Cool, thanks, Jen. So yeah, we're just going to look here now and see, like, has the game changed and why are the rules still the same? So I'm just going to take us on a little bit of a historical journey to look at working hours. But first, I just want to tap in here, and we use this actually to communicate this event there last week, which you might have come across this acronym, You Only Live Once, YOLO. And it was a phrase coined by the New York Times to reflect changing priorities and the desire to seize the day and try something different. So I suppose many years ago, people would have gone into a job and they might have stayed there till retirement. But we now know that younger generations, they're not willing to do that if they're not happy, if an organization isn't aligned with their values, and if they're not, I suppose, to use the Marie Kondo expression, if it doesn't bring them joy, and we're seeing lots more of that. So this pandemic burnout is driving employees to look elsewhere for work, with some taking a year out or more and replenishing energy levels and finding meaning. And I know Sonja has worked recently with a client, in investment and insurances, and they've actually changed their marketing for the younger people who are taking time out. They're taking maybe a year, anything from a year to 5 years, and they're taking that time out when they're in their 40s to actually go and do what it is that they want to do to bring meaning from life rather than being in a job that doesn't bring them joy. So I have an extract here from somebody who is taking a sabbatical. So this is a female based in the States, and she was in her role for 7 years. And I just think it really encapsulates when we're talking about meaning. And I'm actually going to read through it there, which So she's saying, my goals in taking this sabbatical are to recover from burnout, stress, and a continued lack of attention to self-care. My well has been shallow or periodically empty for some time. My sense of curiosity and creativity have been waning. I wish to recover that source before it dries up. And to be honest, I very much feel a need to step back and unlearn the culture and behaviours of white supremacy that unwittingly has many of us keeping racism in place. I wish to learn the history that I was never taught. I wish to build up practices of meditation and own belonging to steep myself in anti-racism such that I may have the presence and the skills to stop tolerating the intolerable and make sure I'm not contributing to systems of harm. We will be taking our camper on the road, visiting state and national parks, hiking and kayaking to get back into shape and hopefully, vaccinations willing, hugging friends and family along the way. I just think that this encapsulates this quest and this search for meaning. And I know that takes up much of, there's so much discussion and research and books out there and publications in relation to this search for meaning. But people are run dry. their well is actually empty. And on speaking to so many people, I know talking to individuals does not represent a collective, you know, when you're looking at research and stats and figures, but I think, and you're going to be invited there now shortly to go into discussion rooms to discuss this, but just on your own experiences, you know, what have you come across? What are the stories you have heard? What have you experienced out there? And I know I have come across many stories like this, and individuals feeling that they're the only ones actually struggling. But when you open up, you actually, you know, and you share your experience, you get to hear theirs, and it just is like, you know, lifting a weight and the relief that's there, because actually there's many, many people struggling right now. So here we're seeing another example, somebody who's saying that Corona was such a confirmation to me that I want purpose in my work. Again, it's linked with the last story, you know, it's very similar. The problem is that the expectations haven't changed, our client base has been decimated, our people are depleted, but the targets and revenue expectations remain the same. We have people literally dying from stress, and yet it's all about profit and shareholder value. And again, we're looking at investment banking here, and I'm not sure is there a pattern actually coming out in that as well. So now I'm going to take us back here to a quote from 1847 from Karl Marx, who said that by extending the working day, therefore, capitalist production not only produces a deterioration of human labor power by robbing it of its normal moral and physical conditions of development and activity, but also produces the premature exhaustion and death of this labor power itself. That's 170 odd years ago, and yet it could have been written yesterday, because it is so relevant for the times we're in right now. So with that in mind, I'm taking us on a very, very brief timeline here when we're talking about the evolution of working hours. And I'm going back here to the 1800s, to the time of the Industrial Revolution, where 10 to 16 hours per day, 6 days per week, with children working as well, was the norm. And actually, in some instances in the UK, they tried to up it to 18 hours per week, or per day, sorry. And you know, there was disputes and stuff over that, and it was brought back. There was some attempts made, and I'm talking about UK here, but in 1847, really, that's when 10 hours per day for women and children only became the norm. And I think we have to bear in mind, this was in 1847 in the UK. We still have this happening today in some parts of the world, you know. So while it might be a reality that this has been reduced, you know, in the likes of Europe or the US, in other parts of the world, that is not the case. New Zealand, again, they were kind of ahead of the posse, just like they were, I suppose, in COVID in many ways. In 1899, they introduced the 8-hour workday. In the US, the regulation here wasn't until the 1930s, but like William Ford actually increased wages and reduced the working hours from 9 to 8 hours a day. And this increased productivity. And that drove him on to actually, you know, adopt this system, and it encouraged his competitors to do the same, to attract people to work in their organizations. So they were actually what you call the early adapters. They were out there driving. They were doing, I suppose, what they thought was the right thing by their business, but actually it also helped their workers. And they had people come on board with that. But the regulation came afterwards, you know. In 1919 then, after the Treaty of Versailles, the 8-hour workday was put forward by the International Labour Organization, and that was ratified by 52 countries. So this is from Japan to Iran to like all over the globe. Many countries, then that's when they started putting in the foundations for their 8-hour workday. But what we saw then a few years back in New Zealand, there was a 4-day work week trialed, and there was research undertaken in this as well by a company called Perpetual Guardian. And what they found by introducing this 4-day work week, their productivity really improved, the customer satisfaction increased, staff engagement increased as well, and there was less stress and some of the negative fallouts. So actually it was a really, it looked to be, and it's still going actually. Andrew Barnes is the founder of that company, and he does much work in trying to promote the 4-day work week and how it's good for business. And as a byproduct, we actually get all that good employee engagement and the well-being side of things. So we saw earlier this year that Spain launched its pilot of a 4-day work week, you know, introducing 32 hours with interested companies. So they're piloting that. So with that in mind, Sonja, I think you're going to actually launch a poll there just to ask people their thoughts. Do you want to launch that there? So it's asking you, where do you think we are headed? Are we going back to the 1800s with 16-hour workdays? Are we stuck in the pre-COVID normal? Are we on the brink of a work revolution with more balance, maybe more reduced hours? So I can see we've had one response there now. Yeah, there's two coming in. Yeah, so I think it's just we're in a very interesting time where we're being presented with an opportunity, possibly. You know, we can possibly adapt, or maybe we'll stay the same, and the choice will be ours, you know. So we can see here that 7 out of 11 people have filled that in at the minute. So will we go to breakout rooms, so guys?
Yes, I think so, Marion. So what we wanted to do is to give you some time to just reflect on everything that we've spoken about and that we've presented, and also the results of this poll. It seems like most of you feel like we're on the brink of a work revolution. Hopefully you can see the results on screen now. And while you're in the breakout, so we'll give you, just want to check time, we'll give you about 10 minutes in the breakout room to have a conversation. I think we'll put you in small groups of about 3 people per room, Zhen. We will ask you, I think what I'll do is I'm going to put a link in the chat right now. So if you can just copy and paste that one out so long, because if we send a broadcast, then it's difficult to actually copy and paste. We will send a broadcast in the final 3 minutes and ask you to go to this link and to share a story. It might be something that came up in the conversation, you know, whatever the case might be, but we want each of you, so not per breakout room, each person, to share a story into this sense maker collector that we've set up. And then when you come back from the breakouts, we will share some of the results with you as it's come in. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to give you 10 minutes, or let's make it 13. Yeah, make it 10 minutes. So back at 10:47 my time. I don't know what the time is in other places. So Zhen, if you're ready.
Okay. They're now, yeah. People are moving in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just maybe before we start sharing, did all of you have time to enter a story? Do you need another minute? Okay, Zhen, over to you.
All right. I just wait for a few more people to come in. I think people are deep in conversation.
I always find it so disconcerting to be yanked back out of these breakouts. Yeah. Hello, everyone.
Hello. I hope you guys had fun in your conversations. We're still waiting for 2 more.
Maybe while we're waiting for them, did you guys have enough time to put your stories in? Did everybody manage to put a story? Do you need another minute?
I need just 30 seconds.
Okay. We'll give you another minute. We'll be generous.
That's the thing, isn't it? Once you get into these breakout rooms, you just want it to continue for, like, if you get into a good discussion, you don't want it to stop. You know?
Actually, 60 minutes for something like this isn't enough.
It's not. You want the 90, really.
Yeah. Sean, you're unmuted. Did you want to say something?
I'm wondering how many people on this call are self-employed.
Yeah.
because I always have to giggle when I see the word organization.
You giggle?
Shall we do a show of hands? A show of Zoom hands. How many are self-employed? There you go.
You can see the stress levels and burnout are kind of just like exploding into your screen.
I mean, it's tough when your clients work longer hours than you. I mean, it really puts a lot of pressure on you.
Yeah, it's interesting, Sean. So while we wait for the others, you know, something that's starting to really rear its head now is survivor guilt.
Yes.
You know, and it's
Really?
it's taking many forms. You know, it's almost like, you know, you feel guilty because you're an independent and you can work your hours and you see your clients struggling, But then also, you know, people saying, you know, I still have a job. I can't complain. People around me are losing their jobs. They're dying. So even though I'm working myself to death, I need to be thankful. You know, it's a really interesting. Zhen, I think we probably need to quickly go over to the data. Otherwise, we're going to run out of
Okay.
time.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm just doing one last update to my data set. And okay, let me go.
So this is going to be a small data set, but you'll
Very
get the idea,
small.
hopefully.
Ta-da! So we have 9 entries here. You'll see actually very quickly where most of the dots are already. You'll see that there's quite a number in the middle, quite a number focused on coping in the situation, and then some in between here. So what we're going to do is you can, of course, you know, with a larger data set, as we've shown you earlier, is the percentages are going to pop up and they're a lot more interesting when there's a larger data set. You can also toggle into individual stories. I'm just going to see, I highlighted those 2 around coping with the situation. You can take a look there and see some of the stories that were shared.
Cafes are a godsend. I can relate to that.
I know. I think a lot of people can. And one of the cool things that Sonja showed us earlier with the nice landscapes actually made out of stories and the indexing that you've actually put in. So here, let's look at, I think this one's going to be interesting, right? Where we asked if in the situation, the priorities were the individual or the organization on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we've got people in the situation valued control on the left and autonomy on the right. You'll see quite an interesting pattern. Some actually, you know, more toward autonomy and situations which value the organization. Now, there are not many stories here, but what you could potentially do, oops, sorry, my screen blipped. But what you can potentially do as well, remember that multi-choice question where we asked you if it was a positive, or we've got one more story. So win, if it was a positive or a negative type of experience that you shared, you can also start to filter by that. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to look only at the negative stories. For example, you see the patterns are all toward, you know, the importance of autonomy in the organization here, and some in the middle. So I can highlight that to look at some of the stories that are sitting there, what they're talking about. Zombie. The gulf between the have a choice and have no choice is huge. So again, it's a fairly small data set, but you know, once you get into larger numbers, you can actually start to explore the dispositions, the landscape start to get more interesting. And then it's not just, you know, having a landscape, you're able to actually look at the stories that sit behind that. And that's how we're able to toggle from the stories to the patterns and the patterns back to the stories, and to do that iterative type of, you know, insight finding and emergent meaning making. Sonja and Marion, do you have anything to add there?
I'm just curious, Zhen, if you go to the triad and you color code it according to positive, negative, what you see.
Okay, let's do that.
But no, I don't, you know, it's we're hoping that this set will grow. I think we're quite happy with people sharing this around, Zhen. If you want to send it to your friends, or, you know, send it around to show people how this works. Yep. Okay, yeah. So there's still quite a few stories, so we can't really see much.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that Rory's point, you know, in trying to fundamentally shift the system, do you know what I mean, and the employer's duty of care. And I think like what we're being presented with here can really help with trying to shift the system, because sometimes from a HR perspective or a leader's perspective, you're not sure what first steps can I take, what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, especially when we're looking at going back to the office. Do we insist everybody comes back? Do we leave them all at home? Do we have a mixture in the middle? But this can really help. And we've asked, you know, we're kind of scanning the horizon here, saying what is working well, what isn't working well, and looking for ideas. So I think it can help with the right leaders to try and help us to actually come up with some next steps to make sure that it is a point for your audience. And Sonja, you've done some work in South Africa and it had really interesting outputs. And we've a client in Dublin at the minute, and the stories are really different. So what works for one doesn't necessarily work for the other, you know, and you've mentioned that already in your presentation.
Yeah. So Zhen, we've got 5 minutes left. I think maybe can we open the floor for questions or comments or anything that you'd like to share? It would be maybe something interesting that emerged in your small groups. You can just unmute yourself and talk. You don't have to put up a hand or anything.
So for me, first of all, I want to apologise for being late. I had technical problems, but I was talking to Rory, and you know, it is just fascinating on a Friday morning, sitting here talking to someone on the other side of the world, and you know, hearing that the challenges, you know, and you know, there was conversation around the inequality that this has all generated, and that you can sit with someone on the other side of the world, and so many of the challenges are the same. Although actually the big difference is that inequality. Rory is in South Africa. I'm in the UK. You know, our vaccination levels are at a completely different level, and it's you know, it shows the different pace at which different parts of the world and within countries, different people are going to come out of this. So it's quite sobering, actually, and really interesting.
If I could just add on to what you just said, Jan, as well, as a psychologist, I was saying to Jan, I deliberately chose not to practice in terms of doing, you know, therapy. I wanted to be involved in workplaces and groups and communities, and probably influenced by my training where community psychology was just beginning to become a flavor. And all these years later, as I've looked, and Sonja, I've been following you and the team now for a period of time, and lockdown has actually been fantastic in terms of being able to do exactly this, you know, of meeting and going onto a webinar with Dave Ulrich, who I'd never been able to speak to or hear or engage with in my life before. So suddenly there's a lot more access to incredible information. My question and my challenge is, what do we do with that? You know, so for example, during lockdown, my son's girlfriend is a golfer, and she came back from a tournament, and she kind of said to my wife, "Oh, I've got this like lump on my neck." We're talking a 21-year-old girl who literally was then a week later diagnosed with thyroid cancer a week into our lockdown. And wow. in order for my son to go and see her, we had to actually go and get, you know, God knows how many layers of hierarchy permissions to actually travel so he could actually book her into the hospital, because everything was now COVID ready. And suddenly you no longer are dealing with, you know, the normal kind of course of events in terms of how do you deliver a baby? What happens if you break your wisdom? My son, I've had to move his wisdom teeth operation 4 times now, because every time we try and go, the orthopedic surgeon has suddenly got COVID, and then the hospital's on protocols, and then this. So life has shifted, and my question is that what's in our control? We can have all this information. How are we actually, at one level, be containing it and managing ourselves, and we're keeping safe? But what are we losing out on? So Sean, your question of how many of us are self-employed? Well, in order for me to do those things, guess what? One thing that I've lost is the opportunity to generate income, because, you know, I'm doing the research, I'm getting something ready to bring to market, and now is that time lag in terms of, so the stories are there, and that's why Sonja, your commentary in terms of, you know, the system and the collective and the individual. The flavor at the moment is very much around individuals' well-being, health, and all that kind of thing. And even if we look at these new hybrid workplaces and so on, we're asking the worker, what is their opinion and so on. My query is, what are we changing at the system level? Now, whether that's Jan, in your environment at a local municipality level, whether it's at a professions level, whether it's at an organizational level, or within a community. How do we do both of those things at the same time?
I think that is the million-dollar question, Rory, that you've just posed right at the end of the session, because I think what I am seeing in my clients is they are at the moment, they're almost paying lip service, I think, to some extent, to well-being. They say it matters, but when it comes to, I was spending time with an executive team the other day, so they came in saying, we feel burnt out, we're overwhelmed, we're concerned about our people, all of these things. And then at the end of that workshop, when it came to what are going to be the structural interventions then, how are you going to help your people manage boundaries? Are you going to give them permission, for example, to not schedule meetings on a Friday? Yes. Or are you going to tell them to switch off their phones over weekends? And then exactly what you just said emerged in the room. It's like they need to self-manage. We are, you signed up for the Premier League, you should have known what you're in for. And I think that it is the million-dollar question, but I do think that that tsunami that Marion spoke about and some of these other things that we're talking about is going to probably force systemic change. We may not like how that turns out, though. We are on the time boundary. I don't know, maybe Zhen, we can just give people, show them what the options are from here. And then for those of you who want to hang around, you're welcome to stay. Sean, you asked the question. Marion, can you maybe share your screen again, just with a final slide? We made this one really short, Sean, because we wanted it to be easy to fill in. But we're actually working on creating a suite of SenseMaker products, in particular, probing different aspects of this, because it's a very complex issue. There are aspects around belonging. There are the very practical aspects about returning to the office. There's some interesting dynamics around trust. So we've got a couple of these that we're busy building, and those are more in-depth options for those of you who are interested to know more about this. But then just in the short term, to address some of the sense-making debt that Zhen brought up, we're also offering some sense-making workshops where some with SenseMaker and some without, that will be facilitated by the three of us together. And then Zhen, do you want to quickly talk about the resilience, Ian Snape's resilience training?
Yes, so we've, again, acknowledging this big mental health challenge ahead of us, one of the things that we've been doing is we've partnered with an organization called Frontline Mind, and they've developed the 20-module resilience training offering. It's free, essentially, for a whole year. It's only 500 euros. And you can use it for the whole year. It includes everything from how to manage sleep, how to manage your diet, what are some doorstep techniques that you can actually use because we're lacking rituals. How do you incorporate some of these rituals into your day to disengage? So that's something that's also available. And then the last one, Sonja, which is the SenseMaker engagements. You want to speak to that a bit?
I think I already introduced some of it, but what we're busy doing, so in the past we used to run these really long, like SenseMaker engagements, and we're shifting tack a little bit to experiment with micro engagements. So for example, looking only at belonging and looking only at returning to the office, but to have the ability to link between these frameworks. So we're going to build an extended version of the one that you guys filled in today, almost to give us an overview of what a particular organization might be struggling with. And then we have these other more in-depth ones. Marion also designed a well-being focused one a couple of years ago that we're also tweaking a little bit for this context. So if you're interested in any of those, or seeing that we've got so many people who are independent consultants, if you'd like to offer some of these to your own clients, feel free to get in touch and we can send you more details and pricing and all of those things. But so this is what's available. Marion posted a link to a Google form. So if you're interested in any of these, you can just fill that in, or you can get in touch with us directly. Marion, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I want to point out as well, I'm guessing everybody that's here knows what SenseMaker is, but for somebody who we haven't actually said what it is, but for like the software that we have been showing these dots and
Yes.
triads and stuff. SenseMaker is the software behind that, and it's brilliant. So just in case anyone is wondering what you mean with the SenseMaker, that's the stuff.
Yes.
that does all those.
Thanks for catching that. We just kind of went. So the form that you, or the engagement you filled in, that was the front end of a SenseMaker engagement. I think, Marion, you can probably stop sharing your screen and maybe stop the recording. That is the end of the formal kind of part of this, but